The afternoon of April 18, 1943, hung heavy with heat above Cape Bon in Tunisia. At around 3 o'clock, roughly 1500 hours, one of history's most brutally one-sided air battles was about to commence. The Luftwaffe would suffer devastating losses within the next quarter hour, with estimates ranging wildly. Somewhere between 24 and 59 transport aircraft would fall from the sky. The exact numbers remained unclear, but what mattered far more than the statistics was what would happen next in men's minds. American flyers would remember it as the Palm Sunday Massacre. German official records would later document 24 Junkers 52s confirmed destroyed and 35 others damaged beyond repair. American pilots made bolder claims, insisting they'd downed 50 to 70 enemy aircraft. The numbers told different stories depending on who was counting, but the real significance lay deeper than any tally sheet. 15 minutes, that's all it took. 47 American P40 Warhawks and 12 British Spitfires would demonstrate such absolute mastery of the air that German confidence in their eventual victory began to crack. They were about to face 65 German transport planes escorted by roughly 15 Bf-109 fighters and 4 or 5 Bf-110s. The outcome would be lopsided beyond measure, at least 24 transports destroyed, 35 damaged, 9 Bf-109s shot down, and 1 Bf-110 lost against just 6 P-40s and a single Spitfire. The American kill ratio revealed something the German High Command had considered impossible. The Allies had achieved air superiority, and they'd done it with machines German strategists had written off as second-rate. What those German pilots didn't realize, climbing into their cockpits that morning, was that every secret they possessed had already been stolen. Ultra-intelligence had cracked their codes. American fighter squadrons had trained relentlessly for exactly this scenario, and the industrial powerhouse they'd been taught to despise had produced warriors trained in systematic, methodical destruction. By April 1943, the situation in North Africa had become desperate for the Axis. The Germans and Italians had roughly 250,000 troops trapped in Tunisia, squeezed between Montgomery's 8th Army pressing from the east and American forces advancing from the west. Every bullet, every drop of fuel, every bandage had to come by air. The Mediterranean itself had turned into a graveyard. Axis ships were being sent to the bottom faster than replacements could arrive from Italy and Greece. The Allies launched Operation Flax on April 5th, designed specifically to strangle this aerial lifeline. This wasn't random fighter patrols hoping to get lucky. This was systematic interdiction, methodical and ruthless. Codebreakers working at Bletchley Park were reading German signals almost as fast as they were sent. American and British squadrons received precise details: transport schedules, flight routes, escort numbers. The Germans didn't know their Enigma machine had been cracked wide open. The Luftwaffe had scraped together every transport it could find for the supply run to Tunisia. The workhorse of this operation was the Junkers 52 Trimotor, a 3-engine transport that had hauled cargo and troops from Spain to Crete. These aircraft had become the backbone of German airlift operations. By spring 1943, they were making multiple runs daily, crossing from Sicily down to Tunisia and back again, their cargo holds stuffed with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement personnel. The Germans believed they'd taken every reasonable precaution. The transports flew at barely 50 feet above the water, skimming so low that radar couldn't track them effectively. Fighter cover came from elite units like Jagdgeschwader 27 and 53, flown by men who'd survived years in the Desert War. Mission timing was deliberately varied, unpredictable. Yet all these careful measures meant nothing when your enemy could read your mail. On the afternoon of April 18th, a large German formation was heading back towards Sicily after completing a supply delivery. 65 Junkers 52s flew in tight V-shaped formations for mutual defense, escorted by experienced fighter pilots from JG-27's 2nd Squadron and elements of JG-53. Many of these escort pilots had painted kill marks on their fuselages, veterans of hundreds of hours in combat. But they carried a fatal weakness: fuel limitations. The Bf-109 was a magnificent aircraft, but its range was severely limited. When operating at the edge of their capabilities over Cape Bon, These fighters had perhaps 20 to 30 minutes of combat fuel remaining. Any prolonged dogfight would force them to either disengage or ditch in the Mediterranean. This constraint had been noted by Allied intelligence, catalogued, and would now be ruthlessly exploited. The 57th Fighter Group had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Based at LG-6 Airfield in Tunisia, they'd spent weeks conducting specialized training for large-scale transport interceptions. They committed all their squadrons to the coming engagement, joined by the 314th Fighter Squadron from the 324th Fighter Group, a total of 47 P40 Warhawks. Overhead, 12 Spitfires from 92 Squadron of the RAF would provide high-altitude cover. The Warhawk wasn't the fastest or most advanced American fighter in the theater, but it had been meticulously modified for Mediterranean operations. New superchargers gave it better altitude performance. The 50 caliber machine guns had been precisely adjusted to converge their fire at 250 yards, the ideal range for tearing apart transport aircraft. The guns themselves carried a mixture of armor-piercing, incendiary and tracer rounds, chosen specifically for this mission. Every detail had been calculated. Around 3 in the afternoon, the German formation appeared, flying northeast towards Sicily at extremely low altitude. Accounts vary. Some observers swore they were no higher than 50 feet above the water. Others said 1,000. Regardless, they flew low enough to be silhouetted against the sea below. The transports maintained their defensive V formations, mutual protection that had worked against sporadic attacks, but would prove catastrophic against concentrated assault. The Allied fighters were perfectly positioned. The P-40s climbed to about 4,000 feet. The Spitfires established their patrol at 15,000 feet overhead, and the setting sun hung behind the British and American formations, making them invisible against the glare until it was far too late. The German transports, meanwhile, were backlit perfectly against the water. When the Allied fighters struck, the German escort commander faced a cruel choice. Climbing to fight meant burning irreplaceable fuel and leaving the transports defenseless. Staying low meant surrendering altitude advantage to attackers who could dive through them repeatedly. He ordered his fighters upward to engage. It was courageous, but it was futile. What followed was less a battle than an execution. The P-40s rolled into dives, peeling off one after another in successive waves. Each pilot picked his target methodically and attacked with machine-like precision. The transport's defensive guns, typically a single 13mm machine gun mounted above the fuselage and two 7.92mm guns in the side windows, proved pathetically inadequate against the concentrated firepower of 50 caliber machine guns. German passengers on some transports desperately fired rifles and pistols through the windows, courageous but utterly useless against fighters moving at hundreds of miles per hour. The thin aluminum skin of the Junkers 52 offered no protection whatsoever against 50 caliber rounds. The bullets punched through like paper. The German fighter escort fought with everything they had, but they were outnumbered and tactically outmaneuvered. The Spitfires engaged them at altitude, keeping them tied up, while the P-40s continued their methodical slaughter of the transports below. German pilots later described the anguish of watching their charges being torn apart, while fighting for their own lives against overwhelming odds. Minutes stretched into an eternity of fire and metal and chaos. The sea below gradually filled with burning wreckage. Some transports exploded violently in mid-air, their fuel tanks ignited. Others fell in flaming spirals toward the water. Many pilots attempted emergency landings along the Sicilian coast, nursing crippled, smoking aircraft toward safety. German official records would later document the results. 24 Junkers 52s destroyed completely, 35 more damaged so severely they'd never fly again. The human cost painted a different picture than simple aircraft tallies. 20 aircrews killed, 28 wounded, 50 missing. These figures likely counted only flight crew, not the passengers packed into those transports. Those aircraft carried far more than just pilots and co-pilots. They held ground personnel, administrative staff, wounded soldiers being evacuated to rear hospitals, specialist technicians whose knowledge couldn't be replaced, mechanics who understood the temperamental engines of various aircraft. radio operators who kept communications functioning across the supply network, medical personnel tending wounded men. Every destroyed transport represented not merely an aircraft, but a crippling blow to German operations. These weren't combat troops being lost, but the support structure that made combat possible. American losses were comparatively modest: 6 P40s and 1 Spitfire, along with their pilots killed or captured. The disparity was staggering. Kill ratios ranged from 4 to 1 at minimum to 10 to 1 at best, depending on which loss figures you accepted. The tactical superiority achieved that afternoon was absolute. Declassified documents later revealed how thoroughly ultra-intelligence had shaped the entire operation. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park had provided complete details of the German schedule days in advance. American planners knew how many aircraft would be flying, what routes they'd take, how many fighters would escort them, even what cargo they were carrying. This intelligence advantage allowed the Allied fighters to position themselves perfectly. They were already waiting at altitude when the Germans appeared. Fuel loads had been calculated to the gallon for extended combat. Ammunition selection had been optimized for transport destruction. The Germans never suspected their communications had been compromised. Post-war interrogations of captured officers revealed they believed the interception was either a lucky coincidence or the result of coast watchers spotting the formation. The possibility that their Enigma machine was broken never occurred to them. This ignorance allowed the Allies to continue exploiting this intelligence advantage throughout the remainder of the war. At Luftwaffe headquarters in Rome, initial reports of the catastrophe sparked disbelief. Staff officers assumed the numbers were exaggerated, that panic and confusion had inflated the damage reports. As confirmation arrived from multiple sources, surviving aircraft, Italian observers, German naval units fishing survivors from the sea, the scale of the disaster became impossible to deny. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commanding all German forces in the Mediterranean, made an immediate decision. He suspended all daylight transport operations. His war diary entry for April 18th was terse. Daylight transport operations have become impossible. Night operations only until further notice. Hitler's response was predictably extreme and ultimately pointless. He demanded courts-martial for the escort commanders, accused transport pilots of cowardice, and ordered immediate massive reinforcement of fighter strength in the Mediterranean. Reinforcements that were simply impossible to provide given Germany's stretched resources everywhere else. The Palm Sunday massacre effectively ended German daylight aerial resupply to Tunisia. Combined with ongoing Allied interdiction of sea routes, this severed the Axis supply line at the worst possible moment. Units that had maintained their defensive positions despite chronic material shortages now faced complete logistical collapse. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commanding German forces in North Africa, understood the implications immediately. Without aerial resupply, his forces could hold defensive positions for perhaps weeks. The surrender of Axis forces on May 13th, less than a month after Palm Sunday, was directly accelerated by the transport crisis created by the massacre. Beyond the immediate tactical effects, Palm Sunday announced something fundamental to every German soldier in North Africa. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect them. German operations had depended entirely on air superiority. Now they would fight without air cover. This psychological impact rippled through the entire theater, affecting morale from frontline troops to headquarters staff. The massacre also revealed technological disparities that stunned German participants. The P40 Warhawk, which German intelligence had classified as obsolete, demonstrated capabilities that shattered expectations. Modified engines allowed altitude performance that shouldn't have been possible for the aircraft type. Gun sights provided accuracy that seemed impossibly precise according to German after-action reports. Yet perhaps the most fundamental advantage was almost mundane in its simplicity. American radios worked. Every P-40 pilot maintained clear communication with his wingman and flight leader. Coordinated attacks that would have been impossible became routine. German formations, meanwhile, were plagued by radio failures that fragmented their formations precisely when cohesion mattered most. This basic technological reliability translated directly into tactical superiority. American logistics and maintenance proved superior as well. The P40s operating over Cape Bon were maintained at high operational readiness despite the harsh desert environment. Spare parts were available in quantity. Fuel was plentiful. Ammunition was never in short supply. German units, by contrast, struggled chronically with shortages of everything. A pilot couldn't fly if his aircraft was grounded waiting for replacement parts. He couldn't fight effectively if his aircraft was maintained by exhausted mechanics working without proper tools. Perhaps most decisive was the vast gap in pilot training. American pilots flying on Palm Sunday had averaged over 300 flight hours before entering combat. They'd spent months in the safe American skies, practicing formation flying, perfecting gunnery, navigating complex routes, and rehearsing combat tactics. They arrived in theater already proficient, already combat-ready. German pilots, by contrast, were products of an increasingly abbreviated training program, rushed into combat with fewer hours and less preparation. The shortage of fuel made it impossible to maintain pilot training schedules. Experienced flight instructors found themselves reassigned to active combat squadrons. Training aircraft that should have remained in schools was stripped away and sent into operational service instead. The carefully constructed system that had given the Luftwaffe its early dominance crumbled under the weight of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. This gap would only grow wider as months passed. By the end of 1943, young American pilots completed roughly 400 hours of instruction before entering combat, while their German counterparts received barely 80 hours before facing enemy fighters. The events of Palm Sunday were not some unfortunate exception, but rather a preview of what systematic destruction looked like. This wasn't an isolated tragedy, but rather part of the broader Operation Flax campaign that unfolded across several weeks. Just days earlier, on April 5th, Allied fighter pilots had already caught and destroyed 14 Ju-52 transport aircraft, with many others left damaged and burning. By April 10th, another coordinated sweep claimed 20 more transports. Then, on April 19th, the day following Palm Sunday, South African squadrons attacked Italian SM-82 transports, shooting 16 of them out of the sky. But the real shock came on April 22nd, when Allied fighters encountered a formation of massive Me-323 Giants, enormous six-engine cargo haulers that represented the largest aircraft operating anywhere in the entire Mediterranean theater. Of those 16 colossal machines, 14 were annihilated in the engagement. Each one had been loaded with 12 tons of fuel that German forces desperately needed. The human cost was staggering, with 138 crew members aboard those giants, yet only 19 made it home alive. Over 100 transport aircraft had vanished in less than 3 weeks, crippling not just Mediterranean supply runs, but German resupply operations across every theater of war. The Luftwaffe's transport fleet would never truly bounce back from what happened during Operation Flax. Palm Sunday represented the moment when everything changed for German air power. The physical aircraft could eventually be replaced, but the expertise walking away in body bags could not be recovered quickly. Every destroyed Ju-52 carried a pilot who had flown hundreds or thousands of hours in the cockpit, alongside a co-pilot and radio operator who possessed skills developed over years of experience. These weren't raw recruits, but seasoned professionals. The effect on morale swept through the entire Luftwaffe like a poison. Transport pilots who had once flown their routes almost unmolested now understood the awful truth: they were piloting coffins. Fighter pilots realized their own limitations. They simply didn't have the numbers or capability to shield these lumbering cargo vessels. Ground commanders faced a harsh reality: supplies could no longer be guaranteed from the air. Back in German command centers, Palm Sunday forced a painful reckoning. If the Luftwaffe couldn't defend transport planes in broad daylight, how on earth could it possibly shield German cities from the American bombing campaign everyone knew was coming? The slaughter over Cape Bon foreshadowed the firestorm that would consume Germany itself. For the Americans, Palm Sunday proved their entire strategic approach was working exactly as planned. Rigorous pilot instruction, advanced fighter design, and massive industrial output had produced absolute air superiority in the arena. Young men raised in a democratic system that Hitler's ideology considered soft and decadent had shown themselves to be devastatingly lethal. The 57th Fighter Group earned a Distinguished Unit Citation for their performance that day. Many of the pilots involved became aces, achieving 5 confirmed victories or more in a single morning's work. Beyond medals and official commendations, Palm Sunday gave American aviators something more valuable: unshakable confidence. They now knew they could defeat the Luftwaffe whenever combat conditions favored them. The victory also vindicated American fighter tactics and training philosophy. American squadrons didn't teach pilots to seek personal glory or individual kills. Instead, they emphasized coordinated teamwork, controlled use of ammunition, and accomplishing the assigned objective. This methodical approach, which some European observers dismissed as lacking true warrior spirit, had just proven devastatingly superior to anything thrown against it. Both sides rushed to use Palm Sunday in their propaganda campaigns, though with sharply different results. American newsreels featured gun camera footage showing German transports disintegrating in explosions, accompanied by catchy titles like Easter Egg Hunt over Tunisia and Luftwaffe's Black Sunday. The filmed evidence, carefully edited but undeniably real, conveyed American air dominance in unforgettable images. German propagandists faced a much harder challenge, explaining the catastrophe. Their first instinct, simply denying the losses, collapsed immediately when neutral countries confirmed American claims. Attempts to shift blame onto the Italians or mechanical failures fell apart when survivors started talking. Eventually, German propaganda repackaged the disaster as heroic sacrifice, brave transport crews flying to their deaths while resupplying surrounded comrades fighting for the Reich. Within the Wehrmacht, however, soldiers knew the real story. They whispered dark jokes about Luftwaffe Easter eggs that shattered at the slightest impact. Mocking songs about German Air Force leadership circulated through barracks and mess halls. The carefully maintained myth of Luftwaffe invincibility, nurtured since the Spanish Civil War, evaporated over Cape Bon. The ripples from Palm Sunday's destruction spread far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Hitler, shocked by the sheer scale of losses, ordered fighter squadrons withdrawn from the Eastern Front to provide Mediterranean defense, precisely when Germany would need those fighters most before the brutal Battle of Kursk. The Americans, energized by their triumph, pushed harder to accelerate the Sicily invasion timetable and pressed forward with daylight bombing raids on German industrial targets. German military officers began studying Palm Sunday intensely, wrestling with uncomfortable conclusions about American capabilities. Those who had written off Americans as amateur soldiers in fancy uniforms suddenly had to confront an inconvenient truth. American factories and organizational systems had built fighting forces that matched anything Europe could field. The massacre made an impression on certain German officers who would later join the resistance movement against Hitler. Watching American military power on display convinced many that the war had already become unwinnable. If America could achieve such overwhelming superiority in the Mediterranean, what would happen when American legions finally arrived in Europe in full strength? Aviation historians have long debated the exact number of aircraft destroyed during the Palm Sunday engagement, but all agree it ranks among the most lopsided air battles of the entire war. German records documented 24 Ju-52s, confirmed destroyed with 35 damaged, while American pilots claimed between 50 and 70 enemy aircraft lost. Regardless of exact numbers, the tactical and strategic consequences proved enormous. The battle demonstrated core principles that shaped air combat throughout the remaining war years. Information advantages unlock tactical surprise. Keeping technological edge requires systematic application to exploit it fully. Better training can outweigh combat experience. Coordinated formations outperform individual brilliance. Manufacturing capacity translates directly to battlefield superiority. Military aviation academies worldwide continue analyzing Palm Sunday as a textbook example of effective interdiction strategy. The systematic elimination of enemy supply aircraft through proper intelligence gathering, careful planning, and flawless execution still serves as a model for contemporary air operations. Yet Palm Sunday also presents troubling ethical questions about warfare in modern times. The Ju-52s certainly qualified as legitimate military targets carrying supplies to enemy forces. But those aircraft also contained human beings, several of them non-combatants like medical orderlies and administrative staff who died in terrible ways. The American pilots who participated grappled with conflicting emotions about their accomplishment. They had performed their duty with remarkable effectiveness, yet many struggled with the imbalanced nature of the combat. Destroying virtually helpless transport planes, however militarily necessary, lacked the mutual danger of fighter versus fighter duels they had imagined. These moral tensions illuminate how warfare had fundamentally transformed from personal contests to industrial-scale killing. The Americans had pursued no romantic notions of glory, simply completed an assigned mission. They had killed methodically, systematically, without anger or malice, but also without hesitation or restraint. This represented modern combat in its truest form, remote, mechanized, and terrifyingly efficient. The Palm Sunday massacre offers lasting insights for military strategists and commanders. First, superior intelligence enables tactical advantages far out of proportion to the forces involved. Second, once air superiority is established, systematic destruction of enemy supply lines becomes possible. Third, training infrastructure and industrial production capacity determine victory in prolonged warfare. Fourth, transport operations prove extremely vulnerable without complete air superiority overhead. Modern militaries observing this lesson have invested extensively in fighter escorts and defensive equipment for cargo aircraft, while prioritizing air superiority above all other objectives. Fifth, air superiority rarely lasts forever. The Luftwaffe dominated European skies from 1939 through 1941, yet by 1943 hung helpless above Cape Bon. Military advantage remains temporary and constantly shifting. Innovation and continuous improvement become essential for survival. The Palm Sunday battle lasted approximately 15 minutes from start to finish, yet echoed throughout the rest of the war and beyond. In those quarter-hour moments over Mediterranean waters, American fighters accomplished more than simply destroying aircraft. They demonstrated American air power had arrived as the preeminent force that would remain dominant for decades to come. The Germans witnessing this spectacle comprehended more than tactical setback. They were observing a fundamental shift in military reality itself. A mobilized industrial democracy, when properly directed, could generate military might that totalitarian systems simply could not match. Palm Sunday validated that technological innovation, systematic training methods, and manufacturing scale could overcome experience, individual prowess, and ideological fervor. The Americans had transformed fighting into systematic science, and science was demonstrating its superiority over the warrior mythology that had fueled German early victories. The Palm Sunday massacre represents a pivotal junction in aerial combat development. Within approximately 15 minutes on that April afternoon in 1943, American fighters destroyed or badly damaged somewhere between 59 and 70 German aircraft. The precise count pales beside the psychological earthquake it triggered. The Luftwaffe's ability to supply forces across the Mediterranean lay in ruins, directly hastening Axis collapse in North Africa. More profoundly, Palm Sunday vindicated every element of American military doctrine. Rigorous pilot preparation, commitment to technological edge, integration of intelligence into planning, and capacity to maintain sustained operations had delivered total tactical superiority. Young Americans dismissed by Nazi ideology as weak democracy, products had emerged as genuinely lethal warriors. The Germans, absorbing this catastrophic loss, faced more than military setback. They confronted the emergence of American military ascendancy that would characterize the remainder of the conflict and the decades that followed. The industrial society they had scorned had generated warriors far exceeding what Nazi philosophy anticipated. Military professionals continue studying Palm Sunday as an examination of air power applied brilliantly. Intelligence advantage delivered tactical surprise. Technical superiority saw systematic application and exploitation. Superior preparation overwhelmed experience and expertise. Manufacturing became combat multiplier. The transport pilots lifting off from Tunisian runways that afternoon carried routine expectations, a standard supply mission back to Sicily. Their fighter protection, battle-hardened through years of Mediterranean operations, possessed confidence in their defensive mission. 15 minutes later, both certainties lay burning on Mediterranean waves. The Americans had accomplished far beyond tactical success. They had pioneered a warfare type destined to dominate coming decades. Palm Sunday violence consumed merely 15 minutes of clock time, yet those 15 minutes permanently altered air combat's character. The era of individual heroic champions was concluding. The epoch of systematic mechanical dominance had begun. The Germans, experiencing this transformation, experienced legitimate shock. They witnessed not merely their current defeat, but American air superiority's birth, a force that would reshape international relations. Fundamentally, Palm Sunday confirmed warfare's essential reality. Victory flows not to those boldest or most seasoned, but to those most efficiently combining intelligence, mechanical advantage, preparation, and manufacturing output into devastating military capability. On that Mediterranean afternoon in 1943, American pilots executed this formula with terrible accuracy. The Germans could reject this reality, but rejection changed nothing. The wrecks floated in the sea, the men did not return, and history was writing itself. These 15 minutes over Cape Bon continue shaping military doctrine worldwide. Aviation services globally examine the engagement, absorbing lessons regarding air superiority's necessity, transport vulnerability without fighter cover, and intelligence's crucial role in contemporary conflict. Palm Sunday transcended tactical achievement, demonstrating how wars would be won through modern application of organized capability.